She had $43 in a cardboard box when they told her to leave. 19 years old, no family behind her, no plan ahead. The city did not notice her go. The street took back her footsteps before she reached the corner, and by nightfall the room she had rented for 2 years held someone else's shoes by the door. Some people fall and the ground is soft. For Nora Callum, the ground was concrete, and the fall was long, and nobody was counting. She worked jobs that didn't ask her name, and slept in places that didn't keep records. 8 years passed the way bad winters pass. Slowly, then all at once, leaving marks you don't notice until the cold is gone. Then a letter arrived. A certified envelope with a return address she did not recognize, from a probate office in a county she had not thought about since she was 9 years old. Inside was a name she barely remembered, Edmund R. Callum, and a set of directions to a building on County Road 7 outside a town called Henlow. A tailor shop. Shuttered. Left entirely to her, and at the bottom of the letter, in the attorney's careful typeface, a single line that Edmund had apparently insisted be included word for word. Look inside the walls before you sell anything. She almost didn't go. She sat with that envelope on a Tuesday morning in a diner where she was killing time before a shift, and she turned the brass key over in her fingers until the coffee went cold. There was nothing waiting for her in that direction. There was also nothing waiting for her in any other direction. So she drove. The highway gave way to a state route. The state route gave way to gravel, and the gravel narrowed into something that barely had a name. The world got quieter the farther she went, until the only sound was the engine and the tree line closing in on both sides. What Edmund Callum hid inside the walls of that shop was not a fortune in any ordinary sense. It was something older and stranger, a record of an entire life lived in secret, a kindness so quiet it had never once asked to be seen. Nora would find it with a pry bar and a hammer and hands that did not stop shaking until long after she understood what she was holding. And when she did understand, she would have to decide what kind of person she was going to be. In a town she did not know, in a building she had inherited for reasons she could not yet name, standing in the dust of a man who had never needed anyone to witness what he did. The eviction notice was taped to her door on a Wednesday morning, and Nora Callum read it twice standing in the hallway in her socks. The landlord had given her 10 days, which was 7 more than she expected, and 3 fewer than she needed. She went back inside, sat on the edge of the mattress, and looked at the wall for a while. There was a water stain above the baseboard heater shaped roughly like the state of Ohio. She had looked at it most mornings for 2 years. She had $43 in her checking account and $11 in cash in the pocket of her coat. The coat was a good one. Wool, charcoal gray, bought at a thrift shop in the winter of her 23rd year for $9. And it was the best thing she owned. The rest of what she owned fit into a single cardboard box and a duffel bag with a broken zipper she kept closed with a binder clip. She was 27 years old. She had been 27 for 6 weeks. The job at the laundry had ended in September, when the owner's son came back from wherever he had been and took the position without ceremony. She had worked 3 months at a diner after that, carrying plates of eggs and coffee to people who did not look at her, until the diner changed hands and the new owner brought his own staff. Since then, she had picked up shifts at a grocery warehouse 2 nights a week, scanning barcodes in a cold room from 10 until 4 in the morning. It paid $11.25 an hour. It was the kind of work that left no marks and no record, which suited Nora fine. She had learned early that institutions remembered you for the wrong things. The certified letter arrived on Thursday. She almost did not open it. Certified letters had meant, in her experience, either a debt collector or a court date, and she had neither the money for the first nor the patience for the second. But the return address was not a collection agency. It was the office of a probate attorney named Gerald Marsh, located in a town called Delverton, in a county Nora had not thought about since she was a child. She stood at the mailboxes in the lobby and looked at the envelope for a long moment before she carried it upstairs. She read it at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee going cold beside her. The language was formal and slow, the kind of prose that had been designed to say a precise thing in the most careful possible way. Edmund R. Callum, age 81, had died on the 17th of March. He had no surviving spouse. He had no children. His estate, modest by any measure, consisted of a commercial property on County Road 7, outside the town of Henlow, and the contents thereof, and a checking account holding $412. He had named Nora as his sole beneficiary. He had done this, the attorney's letter explained, without explanation, in a will signed and witnessed 11 years prior. Nora set the letter down. She picked it up again. Edmund Callum had been her father's uncle, which made him her great-uncle by blood and a stranger by every other measure. She had met him twice that she could remember. The first time she was 4 and retained nothing. The second time she was 9, at a family gathering in a house she could no longer picture, and Edmund had sat in a wooden chair in the corner of a room and said very little to anyone. He was a tall man with a measuring tape looped around his neck even at a family dinner, and when Nora had drifted away from the adults and into the corner near his chair, he had looked at her without alarm and pressed a peppermint into her palm. He did not ask her name. He did not tell her to go find the other children. He just handed her the peppermint and looked back at the room. She had thought about that once or twice over the years. The way you think about small things that stay with you for no reason. You can name. At the bottom of the attorney's letter, below the formal language and the contact information and the instructions for presenting identification at the office in Delverton, there was a single additional line. Gerald Marsh had noted in a separate brief paragraph that Edmund had requested it be included verbatim. The line read, "Look inside the walls before you sell anything." That was all. No punctuation at the end. No explanation attached. She read the line 4 times. Then she turned the envelope over, as if there might be something on the outside that clarified matters. There was none. She folded the letter along its original creases and set it on the table next to her coffee cup, and sat there while the afternoon light moved across the floor. The brass key was in the envelope. She had shaken it out without noticing, and it had landed beside the letter, and she had not registered it until now. It was a small key, the kind that might open a padlock or a strongbox, and it was attached to a paper tag with a length of cotton twine. On the tag, in handwriting that was careful and very small, someone, Edmund she assumed, had written one word: shop. The ink was dark blue, old-fashioned, the kind left by a pen with a real nib. The tag itself was worn soft at the corners, as if the key had spent a long time in someone's pocket. Nora picked the key up and held it in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. The worn paper tag turned slowly on its length of twine. She closed her fingers around it and sat for another few minutes without moving, and then she got up and went to find a road atlas she kept in the duffel bag, because her phone had been disconnected 6 weeks ago, and she did not know where County Road 7 was, or how long it would take to reach a town called Henlow, from where she was sitting. She found Henlow on the atlas after several minutes of searching. A small dot in a county she had driven through once without stopping, roughly 4 hours south and west of the city. The atlas was 3 years out of date, and the pages for that region were slightly warped from a time the bag had gotten wet. She traced County Road 7 with her finger and found that it ran east from Henlow Center for about 6 miles before the map's detail gave out. Whatever was at the end of that road, the atlas did not say. She had 10 days before she had to be out of the apartment. She had $43 in the bank and a cardboard box and a duffel bag and a wool coat and a brass key on a paper tag. She did not have a plan. What she had was a letter from a dead man who had once handed her a peppermint without asking anything in return, and a single line of instruction that made no sense yet, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person when every door behind them is already closed. She set the key on top of the folded letter and pressed it flat with her thumb. Then she started thinking about what she would need for 4 hours of driving. She left on a Friday before the city had fully woken up. The cardboard box and the duffel bag were already in the back seat of her 2001 Civic, which she had kept running for 3 years on a combination of second-hand parts, a YouTube video about serpentine belts, and whatever money she could scrape together when the check engine light came on and stayed on. The car burned oil slowly, and the heater worked on its own schedule, and the passenger side window had to be coaxed up with both hands after you rolled it down, so she did not roll it down. It was mid-April, and cold in the mornings, still. The kind of cold that had not decided yet whether it was finished. She had filled the tank the night before, $31.40 at the station on Mercer Street, which left her $11.60 in cash and $43 in the bank. She had brought a sleeve of crackers and a jar of peanut butter, and a thermos of coffee she had made at 2 in the morning when she could not sleep. The atlas was open on the passenger seat, the relevant pages folded back. County Road 7 traced in pencil because she did not own a highlighter. The brass key was in her coat pocket. She could feel it there against her sternum when she leaned forward over the wheel. The interstate was manageable at that hour. Trucks mostly, running their quiet pre-dawn routes, headlights boring through the gray. She drove at 62 miles an hour the way she always did, which was fast enough to keep up and slow enough to avoid the kind of attention she did not want. The city thinned out over the first 40 minutes, the density of exits decreasing, the billboards getting farther apart, the overpass lights giving way to stretches of dark. By the time she reached the interchange for Route 31, the sun was coming up behind her, flat and pale, and the land on either side of the road had opened into fields still brown from winter. Route 31 was a 2-lane state highway with a broken center line and gas stations every 20 miles or so. She passed a diner with 6 trucks in the lot and thought about stopping, but did not. She ate crackers with peanut butter on a spoon and drank the coffee from the thermos cap and kept driving. The radio got bad around mile 40, so she turned it off and drove in quiet, which suited her. She had always preferred the quiet. Silence was not an absence, she had decided somewhere in her early 20s. It was a texture. Some silences were thin and some were dense, and the one inside the Civic that morning was dense in a way that felt almost like company. Edmund came back to her in pieces, not memories exactly, more like impressions, sensory fragments that her mind had filed without labeling. The smell of chalk dust and cedar, which she now understood must have come from his shop. The particular stillness of a man who did not move unless he meant to. The measuring tape. She remembered it clearly now, a cloth tape in a worn leather case that hung around his neck at the family dinner, and how she had thought it strange that a man would wear his work tools to a meal the way other men wore ties. He had not explained it, he had simply worn it, and if anyone at the table had found it unusual, they had not said so in front of him. Her father had not spoken much about Edmund. Her father had not spoken much about anything. And then he had left when she was 12, and the family he had come from, the Callums, scattered across 3 states, had receded along with him. Nora had not tried to re-establish contact. There had been no argument, no dramatic rupture. The connection had simply loosened, the way old thread does when you pull on it, until it came apart in your hands and you were holding 2 separate pieces and the garment was on the floor. She did not know who Edmund Callum had been to the rest of them. She knew only what she had observed herself, which was a tall man in a corner chair who had given her a peppermint and asked for nothing. The turn onto County Road 7 was easy to miss. There was a green sign, but one corner had been bent back at some point and never straightened, so the road name was half obscured. She caught it only because she had been watching the mileage on the odometer since the last reference point on her atlas. The road itself was gravel, recently enough graded that the center was still crowned, and the runoff ditches on either side were clean. The Civic's tires made a sound on the loose stone that she felt more than heard, a low, sustained vibration that came up through the floor and into her feet. The tree line on both sides was dense, oak and ash mostly, bare still, their branches making a lattice overhead that filtered the morning light into strips. The road narrowed after 2 miles, not dramatically, but enough that she kept her eyes on the edges. The gravel gave way by degrees to packed dirt with gravel scattered over it, and then to dirt with 2 worn tracks and a grass median, and then to something that was technically still a road, but only because enough vehicles had traveled it to keep the brush from reclaiming it entirely. She shifted down to second gear. The Civic protested slightly and then settled. The engine note changed, and the trees got closer, and the sky above her shrank to a pale ribbon between the canopy. She saw the building before she saw the sign. It appeared between the trees as a shape first, a long, low structure with a false front, the kind of facade that small commercial buildings wore in the middle decades of the last century to look taller than they were. The paint was the color that white becomes when it has been weathering for 15 or 20 years without attention. Not gray exactly, more like the memory of white. The sign above the door read, "Callum Alterations and Tailoring," though the A in alterations had faded to near invisibility, and the ampersand was gone entirely, leaving only its ghost in slightly less weathered paint. The windows were intact, which she had not expected. The porch boards looked soft but unbroken. The door was padlocked with a lock that matched the key in her pocket. She sat in the car with the engine running for a moment. The building looked back at her without expression. Then she saw the window box, a narrow wooden box fixed beneath the left front window, recently painted a dark green that had no business being that fresh against everything else. And in the window box, planted in rows with the particular care of someone who did not rush such things, a dozen marigolds in early bud. Not open yet, but alive. Recently watered. The soil around the stems was still dark and damp at the edges. Someone had been here, not long ago. She turned off the engine and sat with that for a moment, and then she got out of the car and walked toward the door. The padlock opened on the first try. The key turned without resistance, which surprised her. She had expected rust, stiffness, the small defeat of a mechanism that had been ignored too long. Instead, it released cleanly, with a sound like a single quiet word. She unhooked the lock and set it on the porch railing, and pushed the door open with her shoulder. It swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently. That was the second thing that did not fit. The smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Cedar and chalk, exactly as she remembered, layered over something older. The particular density of a closed room that has held the same air for a long time. Not unpleasant. More like a held breath. The light came in behind her through the open door and laid a long rectangle across the floor. And in that rectangle she could see the dust that had settled on everything, fine and even, the way dust settles when there is no movement to disturb it. But the hinges had been oiled. The marigolds outside had been watered. Someone had been maintaining the edges of this place while letting the interior go still. She found the light switch on the wall to the left of the door and clicked it. 2 of the 4 overhead fluorescent tubes came on, flickering once before they held. The workroom came into view in sections. Along the left wall, a Singer 201 treadle machine sat on its cabinet, the iron wheel still. The needle threaded with dark gray thread as if work had been interrupted rather than concluded. Beside it, a long cutting table made from 2-inch maple butcher block, the surface cross-hatched with decades of chalk lines and blade marks. On the shelves above it, bolts of fabric stood upright like books, wool in charcoal and navy, and a dark brown, the color of creek water in autumn. A few lighter weights she could not identify from across the room. She walked the perimeter slowly. The right wall held a pegboard hung with tools she could name and some she could not. Tailor's shears with 10-inch blades, a seam ripper, a wooden sleeve board, a ham cushion for pressing curved seams, a hem gauge with a sliding marker worn down to bare metal. Below the pegboard, a wooden stool with a cracked leather seat, and on the stool, a pincushion the size of a grapefruit, bristling with pins that had gone slightly rusty at the tips. Everything arranged, everything waiting. The room had the quality of a place that had been paused rather than abandoned. At the back of the room, 3 dressing rooms stood in a row. The curtains were still hanging, heavy cotton duck in a faded olive green, hung on brass rings from wooden dowels. She pushed the first curtain aside. Inside, a 3-panel mirror, the silvering foxed at the corners but intact. A small wooden bench, a single hook on the wall at shoulder height. The floor was clean pine, slightly softer underfoot than the main room. She pulled the curtain closed and tried the second. Identical in layout. The third was slightly larger, built to accommodate a longer fitting, with a bench along one wall and the mirror angled differently. She stood in it for a moment and looked at her own reflection in the foxed glass, her coat, her tired face, the key still in her hand though the door was long since open. She had brought a flat pry bar from a toolbox she kept in the trunk, a 16-ounce hammer and a box of contractor bags. The attorney's letter, and Edmund's instruction at the bottom of it, had been specific enough that she had stopped at a hardware store on the way out of the city and bought the pry bar for $7.90, which had felt like an extravagance and also felt necessary. She went back to the car and retrieved them now, along with the thermos, which still had an inch of cold coffee in it. She started with the baseboards in the main workroom, working systematically from the door toward the back. The pry bar she had bought was a standard 15-inch flat bar, and it did the job well enough on the first 2 walls. The baseboards came away with moderate resistance, revealing plaster and lath behind them, nothing else. She worked without rushing. The hammer rang against the bar and the sound filled the room, and she let it. The plaster dust came down in fine white lines when she pulled each board free. She stacked the boards against the far wall as she went, setting the nails aside in a coffee can she found on a shelf above the cutting table. By the time she reached the dressing rooms, it was past noon. Her knuckles were raw on the right hand from a slip of the bar on the 4th section, and there was a line of plaster dust along her forearm and in her hair. She ate crackers standing up at the cutting table, and drank the cold coffee from the thermos cap, and looked at the 3 curtained doorways in front of her. She was not sure what she was looking for. Edmund had said walls, and she was looking at walls. And so far the walls had given her nothing but dust and old plaster, and the faint smell of chalk that deepened each time she opened a new section. She started with the first dressing room. The baseboard along the back wall came away cleanly. Nothing. She moved to the second. The boards there had been nailed at shorter intervals, 12 inches rather than 16, and each one resisted slightly more than the last. She worked through them in order, the bar finding the gap at each nail, her weight on the handle doing the slow, steady work. Nothing in the second room either, except a single brass button that fell from somewhere when she pulled the last board free and rang across the pine floor and came to rest against the base of the mirror. The third room. She pulled the curtain aside and set her tools on the bench and crouched at the baseboard along the back wall. The first section came free. The second. On the third, the bar went in at the nail gap and she leaned on it and the board gave a 1/4 inch and stopped. She adjusted her angle and tried again. It moved another 1/4 inch. She switched to the hammer, tapping the bar inward to reset the bite, and leaned again. And this time the board shifted differently. Not the outward peel of a board releasing from plaster, but a lateral movement, like something sliding rather than pulling free. She stopped. She pressed her knuckles against the wall above the baseboard. She moved 6 inches to the left and pressed again. Then she did what she should have done at the start of every section. She knocked. Once, lightly, with the flat of her hand. Then she moved her hand and knocked again. The first knock was solid. The second knock was not. It was lighter, briefer, the sound of a space behind it that the first knock did not have. She pulled the bar free and set it on the bench and put both palms flat against the wall and stood there in the quiet dressing room for a long moment. Then she picked the bar back up. She worked the bar in at a lower angle this time, close to the floor where the hollow sound had been deepest. The plaster gave differently here, not crumbling outward the way old plaster does when it has nothing behind it, but flexing, as if something was bracing it from inside. She moved the bar 2 inches to the left and tried again. A crack appeared along the seam where the plaster met the corner stud, thin as a hair at first, then widening as she increased the pressure. Plaster dust fell in a fine curtain. She did not stop. The section came free in one piece, which was unusual. It was not plaster at all, she realized, once she had it in her hands. Or rather, it was plaster over a thin sheet of 1/4-inch plywood that had been cut to fit the cavity exactly and then skim-coated and painted to match the surrounding wall. Someone had done this carefully. Someone had done this with the intention that it not be noticed. The cut edges of the plywood were clean, made with a fine tooth saw, and the plaster coat over the face was smooth enough that she had not felt the seam when she pressed her palms against it. She set the false panel on the bench and crouched and looked into the cavity behind it. The cedar box sat on a small wooden shelf that had been built into the stud cavity at knee height. The shelf was a single piece of 1x6 pine, dadoed into the studs on either side so it would not shift, and it was level. She could see that even in the dim light, the box sitting flat and square on the shelf, without any shim or adjustment beneath it. The box itself was roughly 14 inches long and 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep, and it was made with the kind of attention that makes a thing look simple. The corners were dovetail joints, tight enough that no daylight showed between the tails and the pins, and the lid fit so precisely that when she lifted it by the small brass latch and found it locked, she felt the faint resistance of a seal rather than just the lock itself. The latch was a simple brass hook and eye, no keyhole. She pressed the lid at one end and it flexed slightly, then held. She turned the box over in her hands, slowly, looking at every face. On the bottom, burned into the wood with what must have been a small soldering iron or a wood-burning tool, were 2 initials and a year, ERC, 1968, Edmund R. Callum. He had made this box himself more than 50 years ago, and he had made it to last. The wood had darkened with age to a deep amber and smelled faintly of the cedar it was built from, clean and dry, the way a linen closet smells in a house that has been well kept. She brought the box to the cutting table and set it under the fluorescent light. The brass latch had no lock. She had mistaken the tightness of the fit for resistance. She lifted the hook from the eye and opened the lid and set it back on its hinges. Inside, the box was lined with a scrap of wool suiting, dark navy, tacked flat with small brass upholstery nails at the corners. Laid on the wool, in 3 neat stacks held with paper bands, was money. Bills. She counted without touching them first, just looking. 3 stacks, each banded, each the same thickness. She picked up the first stack. The band read $300 in Edmund's small, careful handwriting, the ink the same dark blue as the tag on the key. She counted all 3 stacks. $3,200 in total in mixed denominations, the oldest bills at the bottom of each stack. Beneath the money, a ledger. A standard composition ledger with a black marbled cover, the pages ruled in pale green. She opened it to the first page. The date at the top was March 14th, 1971, and below it, in Edmund's hand, a name, Harlan Pruitt. Then a figure, $61. Then a note in abbreviated form she had to read twice to understand. Med St. A, settled. She turned the page. Another name, another figure, another note. The entries went on for page after page, names she did not recognize, amounts ranging from $19 to several hundred, the notes always brief. Tax, county, cleared. Roof, Delverton Lumber, PD. Fuel, Henlow Co-op, settled. The dates ran from 1971 forward with no gaps she could find, the handwriting unchanging decade after decade, only the pen pressure varying slightly in the later years as if the hand had grown less certain but no less deliberate. She turned to the last entry. It was dated the 9th of February of the current year, 6 weeks before Edmund died. The name was Margaret Foss. The amount was $211. The note read, Electric, Tri-County, settled. Below it, the page was blank. The rest of the ledger, perhaps 40 pages, had never been used. She closed it and set it on the cutting table beside the open box and looked at the two things together for a moment. The folded note was at the bottom of the box, beneath where the ledger had been. She had not seen it at first because it was the same color as the wool lining. A small square of paper folded twice. No envelope. No address. She unfolded it carefully. It was a single sheet of the same paper Edmund used for the ledger entries, ruled green, torn along the top edge. The note was short. She read it standing at the cutting table with the fluorescent light humming above her. It said, "This was theirs first. The names are in the book. If you can find them or their people, see that it gets back. Don't make a thing of it. The rest is yours. Keep reading the walls." He had not signed it. He had not needed to. Nora set the note on the table and put both hands flat on the maple surface and stood there. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the intact front windows, she could see the dirt road and the tree line beyond it, the light coming through the bare branches at a low angle now, the afternoon getting on. The fluorescent tubes hummed. The singer sat still on its cabinet with its needle threaded in dark gray. She did not move for a long time. When she finally did, it was to pull the wooden stool out from under the pegboard and sit down on the cracked leather seat, because her legs had gone slightly uncertain beneath her, and she did not want to be standing when she read the note a second time. She read it twice more. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it flat against her knee with her palm, the way you hold a thing you are not ready to put down. The $3,200 sat banded on the cutting table. The ledger sat beside it. She looked at the names she could see on the open page, Harlan Pruitt, Dorothy Ames, Carl and Lois Beckwith, and understood, in the way that understanding arrives sometimes all at once rather than in pieces, what she was looking at. Not a fortune, not a mystery in the ordinary sense. A record. A long, quiet, unwitnessed record of a man paying other people's debts in secret for more than 50 years, and keeping track of every dollar so that the accounting was exact, and telling no one, and now telling her. She locked the shop behind her and crossed the road on foot. The hardware store sat directly opposite, set back from the gravel about 20 feet, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read, Pickett Hardware, Est, 1949. The sign had been repainted at some point, the new paint slightly brighter than the board it sat on, but the lettering style was the same as the original, as if whoever repainted it had been careful to match what was already there. A string of bells above the door announced her when she pushed it open. The store was narrow and long, the kind of layout that had evolved over decades rather than been designed. Shelves added when space allowed, a counter relocated at some point and never quite centered, a back wall hung with items that did not fit the shelf system and so had been given hooks instead. It smelled of linseed oil and rubber and the particular dusty warmth of a building that has been heated by the same wood stove for 30 years. The stove was in the far corner, a squat black cast-iron unit with a damper chain hanging from the flue. And it was going, and the warmth from it reached Nora before she had taken 3 steps inside. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 71, with white hair cut short and practical, wearing a canvas apron over a flannel shirt the color of pine needles. She was marking a receipt book with a pencil when Nora entered, and she looked up without urgency. She did not ask what Nora needed. She set the pencil down on the counter and waited, which Nora recognized as a particular kind of courtesy, giving a person time to arrive before expecting them to speak. Nora said she was Edmund Callum's great-niece. She said she had come to see the shop. The woman behind the counter looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something she had already considered. She said her name was Ruth Pickett and that she had known Edmund for 40 years, and that she was sorry for the loss. And she said all of this in a tone that was plain and meant and not decorated. Then she turned and lifted a coffee pot from a 2-burner hot plate on the shelf behind her and poured a second cup without asking whether Nora wanted one and set it on the counter. Nora set a $1 bill beside the cup. Ruth Pickett looked at the dollar and did not touch it. She pushed the cup closer to Nora's side of the counter and picked up her pencil again and made one more mark in the receipt book and closed it. The $1 bill sat between them for the rest of the conversation, and Ruth did not acknowledge it again, and when Nora left, it was still there on the counter. Nora asked how long the shop had been closed. Ruth said Edmund had stopped taking customers about 3 years back, when his hands had begun to give him trouble, the joints in his fingers, which had made the fine work difficult. She said he had still gone in most mornings for a year after that, just to be in the space, and that she had seen his truck parked outside on mornings when the temperature was below freezing, and she had thought more than once about going over, but had not, because Edmund was not a man who benefited from being checked on. He knew where the hardware store was, she said, and if he needed something, he would come across. Nora asked if Edmund had said anything in the last years about the shop, about what he kept there. Ruth was quiet for a moment before she answered. She said Edmund kept his own counsel about the shop, in the way that some people keep their own counsel about everything that matters to them. Not secretively, not with any obvious concealment, but with a steadiness that made questions feel beside the point. She said he had mentioned once, maybe 4 or 5 years back, that the walls of the shop held more than wool. He had said it the way a person says something they have been thinking about for a long time and have finally decided to let out a little, like a valve releasing pressure. She had not asked him to elaborate, and he had not offered to, and they had gone on talking about something else, and that was the only time. Nora drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter and very hot, and she held the cup in both hands and felt the warmth move into her fingers, which had gotten cold in the shop with the door open. She asked Ruth if she knew a woman named Margaret Fossey. Ruth's expression shifted by a degree, not surprise but attention. She said Margaret Fossey had lived on Route 31 for 30 years, that she was in her late 70s now, and lived alone since her husband passed, and that she had worked the checkout at the Henlow Co-op until her knees had made standing too difficult. She did not ask why Nora wanted to know. Nora did not explain. They talked for another few minutes about the building, the roof, the electrical panel, what condition the plumbing was likely in given that the water had been off for 3 winters. Ruth answered each question directly and without exaggeration, which Nora appreciated. She said the roof was a question mark because Edmund had deferred it, but the windows were good because he had replaced them himself 12 years back with double-pane units he had ordered from a supplier in Delverton and installed over 2 weekends without help. She said the electrical was old, but had been done correctly, with proper gauge Romex and a panel that had been updated sometime in the 90s, because Edmund had an electrician cousin who had come out and done the work in exchange for a suit Edmund made him that he wore to his daughter's wedding, and then to his own funeral 20 years later. Nora set the cup back on the counter and thanked Ruth. She turned toward the door and Ruth said her name. Not Nora, because she had not given her name, but Miss Callum, which meant Ruth had known who she was from the moment she walked in, or had guessed close enough that it made no difference. Nora turned back. Ruth had come around the end of the counter and was holding something out toward her. A pry bar, 18 inches, with a forged head and a rubber grip that had been worn smooth at the peak of the handle where a hand had closed around it for years. It was a better tool than the one Nora had brought. She could see that without picking it up. Ruth said the one Nora had brought. She must have seen it through the shop window, or seen the shape of it in Nora's back pocket. Would not hold on the back panels if they had been nailed at closer intervals. She said Edmund had used 16-penny sinkers on the main walls, but had gone to 12-penny on the back sections, which would require a better bite than a standard flat bar could give. She said this the way a person says a practical thing, without weight, without implication, as if she were simply conveying information about a task Nora was already engaged in and would benefit from having correct. Nora took the pry bar. It was heavier than it looked and balanced well. She did not offer to pay for it, and Ruth did not suggest a price. Nora said thank you again, and Ruth said nothing, and went back behind the counter and opened the receipt book. She went back across the road with Ruth's pry bar in her hand and the coffee still warm in her. The shop received her the way it had before, without ceremony, without resistance, the door swinging inward on its oiled hinges. She set the bar on the cutting table next to the cedar box and the ledger, and stood for a moment orienting herself. She had done the 3 dressing rooms. She had done the main walls. What she had not done was the back wall of the shop itself, the long wall behind the dressing rooms, the one that faced the rear of the property, the one she had looked at and then looked past because it was farther from the door, and she had started at the front and worked toward the back, and had stopped when she found the cavity in the 3rd dressing room. She started at the left corner of the back wall, where the dressing rooms ended and the open workroom resumed. Ruth's bar was immediately different in her hand, the forged head seated against the baseboard with more authority, the rubber grip giving her palms something to press against rather than grip around. The first section came free in under a minute, solid behind it. She moved 18 inches to the right. The bar went in and she leaned and the board released and she checked the wall. Solid. She worked the full length of the back wall in sections, moving right, finding nothing behind the first 4 sections except plaster and the occasional knob of a lag screw driven through the framing from outside. The 5th section, roughly centered on the wall, did not sound the same. She had learned by now to knock first, the flat of her hand, twice, moving 6 inches each time. The first knock was solid. The second was not hollow exactly, but duller, as if the wall behind it was denser rather than empty. She crouched and looked at the baseboard. The nails were set at 8-inch intervals here, closer than anywhere else she had worked, and they had been set with care. No missed strikes on the wood, no surface dimples from a glancing hammerhead. Someone had been deliberate here. She worked the bar in slowly, letting the head find each nail in turn, and took her time. The back panel came away to reveal not plaster and lath, but a face of poured concrete block, which was the exterior foundation wall of the building, running up to the floor joist above. Set into the concrete block, flush with the surface and painted the same gray as the block so that it disappeared against it, was a steel door approximately 20 inches wide and 16 inches tall. It had a combination dial in the center, a standard 3-number rotary lock of the kind used on floor safes and fire-rated lockboxes. The dial was clean. No rust. The housing around it was welded to a plate that had been lag-screwed into the concrete block with 4 3/8-inch anchors, the kind that expand when driven and do not come out without taking the block with them. Edmund had not simply hidden this. He had built it into the structure of the building itself. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the combination dial. She did not know the combination. That was the straightforward fact of it. and she held it plainly for a moment without frustration. Then she went to her coat, which was folded on the stool by the pegboard, and took the attorney's letter from the inside pocket. She unfolded it on the cutting table and read it through again from the top. Slowly this time. The way you read a thing when you know there is something in it you missed the first time. The formal paragraphs, the property description, the account balance, the instruction Edmund had asked to be included verbatim. She reached the bottom of the page. She turned it over. The back was blank except for a single line written in pencil, so light she had to angle the paper toward the fluorescent tube to read it. Not Edmund's handwriting. Neater, more upright. The handwriting of someone trained in penmanship. Gerald Marsh, she assumed, writing at Edmund's direction. The line read, 414-782-603. She went back to the lockbox and crouched in front of it and turned the dial. Right to 41, left past 0 to 78, right to 63. She felt the last number seat and pulled the handle, and the door opened on a pivot hinge, swinging toward her without sound. The interior of the box was lined with the same wool suiting as the cedar box, dark navy, tacked flat. It was roughly the size of a large dictionary lying flat, and it was full. She took the contents out one item at a time and set each on the floor beside her. First, a rubber-banded envelope containing cashier's checks. She counted them without unfolding. 9 checks, each made out to bearer. She did not add the amounts in her head yet. She set the envelope aside and reached back in. Second, a folded document, legal size, with the seal of Henlow County in the upper left corner. She unfolded it enough to read the header. Warranty deed, Callum Alterations and Tailoring, County Road 7, Henlow. The deed was made out in Nora's full name, Nora Jean Callum, in the same careful penmanship as the penciled combination on the letter. Edmund had had this prepared. He had done it 11 years ago when he signed the will, and he had kept it here rather than with the attorney, which meant he had wanted her to find it herself rather than receive it through the mail. She did not know yet what to make of that distinction, but she noted it. Third, at the very back of the box, a sealed envelope. The paper was cream-colored, heavier than standard stock, the kind sold at a stationery counter rather than a drugstore. Her name was written on the front in Edmund's dark blue ink. Below her name, in smaller letters, underlined once. Read this last. She held it in both hands for a moment. It was not thick, perhaps 4 or 5 pages inside, she judged by the weight. She set it on top of the deed and turned back to the cashier's checks. She unfolded the envelope and counted the checks properly this time, recording each amount in her head. $3,000, $8,500, $12,000, $4,250, $6,000, $9,000, $7,500, $5,150, $6,000. She added them twice to be sure. $61,400 in cashier's checks made out to bearer, which meant made out to whoever held them, which at this moment was her. She put the checks back in their envelope and set it on the cutting table beside the cedar box. She stood in the workroom with the deed and the sealed envelope in her hands, and the fluorescent tubes humming above her, and the singer sitting still on its cabinet, and the afternoon going dark outside the windows. She set the deed on the table. She set the sealed envelope on the table beside it. She did not open the sealed envelope. Edmund had been specific. Read this last. She had not yet read everything. She picked up the envelope with her name on it and looked at the underlined instruction and set it back down. Then she went to the stool and sat on it and looked at what the day had given her and did not try to make it smaller or larger than it was. She opened the envelope at the cutting table, standing up, because sitting felt wrong for it. The paper inside was the same cream stock as the envelope, folded in thirds, 4 pages, written on both sides, in Edmund's small, careful hand. The ink was dark blue throughout, consistent. The handwriting of a man who did not rush, even when he was putting down something that had taken him a long time to decide to say. She unfolded the pages and smoothed them flat on the maple surface and read from the top. March 29th. Dear Nora, I am not a man who writes letters easily, so I will ask you to excuse the plain style. I have things to say, and I would rather say them plainly than dress them up and have you miss the point. If you are reading this, you found the box, which means you did not sell the shop before you looked at the walls, which means you are your father's niece in at least one respect. Stubborn enough to follow an instruction, even when it makes no obvious sense. Your father had that quality too, before he lost his way. I hold nothing against him. People lose their way. It is one of the main things people do. I want to tell you about the ledger first, because I think it will seem strange, and I would rather explain it in my own words than have you make up a story about it that is less true than the actual one. In the winter of 1970, a man named Harlan Pruitt came into this shop to have a coat altered. He was a good man. A millwright, worked the grain elevator on Route 14 for 30 years. And he was in a difficulty he did not know how to name out loud. His wife had been in the hospital in Delverton for 6 weeks with a blood condition that turned out to be manageable, but was expensive to manage. And the bills had come in while he was paying the mortgage and keeping the furnace running and feeding 3 children. And he was $61 behind on the hospital account, and the account was about to go to a collector. He did not tell me any of this. I could see it in the way he handled the coat. A man handles a garment differently when he is deciding whether he can afford to have it fixed. I did not ask him about it. I fixed the coat. I charged him $4, which was half what I should have charged. And then I called the hospital billing office in Delverton and paid the $61 against his account and gave a false name when they asked for mine. I do not know why I did it. I had the money. He needed the money. It was not a complicated calculation. What surprised me was how it felt afterward. Not proud, not generous, just level. Like a scale that had been slightly off and was now correctly balanced. I did it again the following spring, for a woman named Dorothy Ames, whose property tax had gone delinquent and whose house was close to a lien. Then for the Beckwiths, who had a fuel debt at the co-op that was keeping them cold. I kept the ledger because I am by nature a man who keeps accounts and because I wanted the record to be exact, not for anyone else to see, for my own sense of order. A tailor keeps track of measurements because a body changes over the years and you need to know where you started. I kept track of the amounts for the same reason, so I knew where I stood, what had been done, what the work had been. I kept the ledger for 53 years. I want to be precise about that. Not 50, not approximately half a century. 53 years from March of 1971 to the 9th of February of this year, when I paid Margaret Fossey's electric bill and wrote the last entry and closed the book. My hands had been bad for 3 years by then, and I knew I was not going to be writing many more entries. I was not sad about it. 53 years is not a small amount of work. If you can find the people in the ledger, or their children, or anyone connected to them, I would ask you to return the money in the first box to them in whatever portions seem right to you. I trust your judgment on that. I chose you for this not because you are family. Family is an accident of birth and does not confer judgment. But because you sat in the corner at your cousin Gerald's dinner in the summer of 1997 and watched me work a seam on a cuff I was repairing right there at the table because it needed doing, and you did not ask me what I was doing or why I had brought work to a dinner. You just watched. You were 9 years old, and you watched the way a person watches when they are actually seeing something. That quality is rarer than people think. The shop is yours outright. The deed is in the box. Do with it what seems right to you. I am not going to tell you to keep it open because I do not think it is useful to receive instructions from a dead man about what to do with your own property. What I will say is that the rent on this building, had I been paying rent, would have been roughly $400 a month for the 40 years I operated here, which I did not pay because I owned it. which means the building gave me somewhere in the range of $190,000 worth of shelter for the work I did in it, and I am grateful for that, and I think gratitude for a place is a reasonable thing. If you decide to stay, the marigolds need water every third day. They are a variety called crackerjack, which grows tall if you let it. Edmund planted the first ones the year he opened the shop, in 1962, and he has replanted them every spring since. I am aware that referring to myself in the third person at this point in the letter is unusual. I have been sitting with these pages for 3 days, and I find I cannot write the word I anymore when talking about the shop. It does not feel accurate. The shop was always something larger than one person. It was where the work got done. That is all a place needs to be. The checks in the box are yours without condition. I accumulated them over a number of years from work I did privately. Alterations and bespoke pieces for a few clients in Delverton who paid well and did not ask for receipts. I set aside what I did not need and converted it to cashier's checks when each sum reached an even number, because cash deteriorates and cashier's checks do not. There is $61,400. I want you to notice that the amount matches the first payment I ever made to Harlan Pruitt in 1970. That is not a coincidence. I calculated what I had and moved the remainder to make it so. A tailor finishes the seam neatly. It is the only way to finish. There is nothing else I need to say except this. You were cast out at 19 and you kept going, which I know because Gerald Marsh has kept me informed over the years at my request, and because I was not going to leave my shop to someone without knowing what kind of person they had become under difficulty. You became a steady one. That is enough. It is, in my experience, the main thing. Yours, Edmund R. Callum. March 29th. Nora read the letter through once without stopping. Then she folded it along its creases and held it in both hands, and stood at the cutting table while the last of the daylight left the windows and the fluorescent tubes became the only light in the room. She did not wipe her face. She pressed the folded letter flat against her sternum with one hand, the way you press a thing you are not ready to put in your pocket, and stood there while the shop held its breath around her. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after Nora had driven back to the city, collected what remained of her things, given notice to the landlord, which cost her nothing since the eviction had already given notice for both of them, and returned to Henlow with the cardboard box and the duffel bag loaded into the back of the Civic, alongside a sleeping bag, a camp stove, and a 32-quart cooler. She had been sleeping on the floor of the shop's workroom, on a section of wool batting she had found rolled behind the cutting table. The sleeping bag was adequate, and the camp stove made coffee in the morning, and the wood stove in the corner, which burned oak splits she had found stacked under a tarp behind the building, kept the room warm enough by 9 that she could work without her coat. She had been working. The first order of business had been the walls, patching the sections she had opened, not to hide them again, but simply to close the building properly. She had driven to Delverton and bought 2 sheets of 1/4-inch drywall, a bag of setting compound, and a package of mesh tape for $23.40 at a building supply on the edge of town. The patches were not finished work, but they were solid. She had also, on that same trip, walked into Gerald Marsh's office on the 2nd floor of a brick building on Delverton's main street and presented the warranty deed and her identification, and sat across from the attorney for 45 minutes while he walked her through what Edmund had left her and what it meant and what the next steps were. Gerald Marsh was a man of about 60, with a careful manner and a habit of pausing before he spoke, as if he wanted to be sure the thought was complete before he let it out. He had known Edmund for 20 years. He said Edmund had been precise about every aspect of the estate and had left nothing unresolved that he could help, which Marsh said was rarer than people assumed. Nora had also called Deirdre Amos, the property lawyer whose name Marsh had given her, and left a message. She had not yet heard back. She was working through the ledger in the evenings, sitting at the cutting table with Edmund's composition book open and a pad of her own beside it, making a second list. Names she could find addresses for. Names whose families she might be able to locate through the county records office. Names that appeared only once against names that appeared 2 and 3 times. The ledger had 217 entries spanning 53 years. She had gotten through the first 64. The man knocked on the shop door at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. She heard the knock from the back of the building where she was measuring the dressing room door frames for new curtain hardware, and she came through to the main room and opened the door. He was perhaps 50, medium height, wearing a quilted vest over a collared shirt, clean-shaven, with the kind of unremarkable face that is difficult to describe afterward. Pleasant enough in arrangement, careful in expression. He held a manila folder in one hand and offered the other to shake. His name was Gary Such. He said he was in property acquisition and development, and that he had heard through the county recorder's office that the Callum property on County Road 7 had recently transferred, and he had taken the liberty of coming out to introduce himself. Nora did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway and he stood on the porch, and the conversation happened in that arrangement, which he accepted without comment. He opened the manila folder and produced a single sheet of paper, a pre-written offer, and handed it to her with both hands as if it were something she would be glad to receive. The offer was for $38,000. The property description was accurate, the legal language was standard, and the amount was printed in a large font at the center of the page as if size conferred persuasion. She read it through and held it at her side. Such said the building was a consideration. The roof, he said, would need significant attention. He had driven past several times, and the ridgeline showed a sag at the east end that typically indicated decking failure under the shingles. He said a roofing contractor he worked with regularly had estimated the repair at somewhere in the range of $12,000. He said the zoning board for the county met in 6 weeks, and that there were some reclassification discussions underway for this section of County Road 7 that might affect the property's permitted uses. He said all of this without urgency, in a conversational tone, the way a person mentions weather. None of it was a threat. All of it was meant to be heard as one. Nora looked at the offer sheet again. $38,000. The cashier's checks in the steel lockbox amounted to $61,400. The deed was clear. She handed the sheet back to Such and said she would think about it. He nodded and produced a business card from the vest pocket and held it out. She took it. He said there was no pressure and that the offer was good for 30 days and that he was easy to reach. He shook her hand again and walked back to a dark green pickup truck parked behind her Civic and drove back down the dirt track toward the gravel without hurrying. She went back inside and set the card on the cutting table next to the singer. She looked at it for a moment. Gary Such Property Group, a phone number with a Delverton exchange. And then she picked up the pad where she was keeping notes on the ledger entries and wrote the name of the roofing estimate he had mentioned and underlined it once. Then she called Gerald Marsh's office and asked if he could recommend a property attorney. Marsh said he could, and gave her Deirdre Amos's direct line, which was different from the number Nora had already left a message at. She called the direct line and Deirdre Amos answered on the 3rd ring. Amos arrived the following morning at 9 o'clock in a mud-spattered Subaru wagon. She was perhaps 45, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she carried a legal pad under one arm and a travel mug in the other hand, and walked the perimeter of the building before she came inside, pausing at the east end of the roof line and looking up at it with the deliberate attention of someone who has looked at many roof lines. Inside, she walked the shop in silence. The main workroom, the dressing rooms, the back wall where the steel lockbox was still open and visible, the wood stove, the cutting table. She did not ask questions during the walk. She made notes on the legal pad. She sat across from Nora at the cutting table and said the zoning reclassification Such had mentioned was a routine administrative review that applied to a 16-mile corridor of county road and had no specific bearing on this parcel. She said the process was procedural and the timeline was accurate. 6 weeks to the board meeting, but that the outcome had no bearing on Nora's permitted uses under the existing designation, which covered commercial and light residential. She said the roof had a sag at the east end that she had noted, and that she knew a contractor in Henlow who had quoted similar repairs at between $4,800 and $6,200, depending on how much decking needed replacement, which was half what such had cited. She said the offer of $38,000 for a free and clear commercial property on a deeded lot of 1.4 acres, even needing roof work, was not a serious offer. She said it plainly, without editorial. Then she asked Nora what she was thinking about doing with the building. Nora told her. Amos made a note on the legal pad and said that was straightforward and that she could handle the necessary filings. She named her hourly rate, which was $90, and said the initial work would likely run between 4 and 6 hours. Nora said that was fine. Amos finished her coffee, closed the legal pad, and stood up. On her way out, she paused at the window box by the front door and looked at the marigolds, which were opening now in the April warmth, the orange heads beginning to loosen from their buds. She did not comment on them. She got into the Subaru and drove back toward the gravel, and Nora watched the car go, and then went inside to continue with the ledger. 3 weeks later, the shop was open. Not announced. Not advertised. Nora had put a card in the window of Pickett Hardware that said, Callum Alterations, reopened, alterations and repairs. And Ruth had taped it to the inside of the glass without comment, and that was the extent of it. The first customer arrived on the second morning, a man in his 60s with a pair of wool trousers that needed the waist let out and the cuffs rehemmed. He set them on the cutting table and named a price he considered fair, and Nora said that was fine. He picked them up 2 days later and paid without negotiating and said the work was good and left. She had not done finish-quality tailoring in years. She had learned it in a shop in the city at 22, briefly, before that position ended. But the Singer 201 was a forgiving machine and the skills had not entirely left her hands. They came back the way most physical things come back. Slowly, then correctly. The roofing contractor Ruth had mentioned, a man named Dale Crocker, who operated out of a shed on Route 31, came out on a Wednesday and walked the ridge with a probe and came back down and said the decking failure was limited to a 12-foot section at the east end, and the rest of the sheathing was sound. He quoted $5,400 for new decking, underlayment, and shingles matched to the existing. The work took 3 days. Nora paid him from the cashier's checks, converting one at the Delverton branch of a savings bank where Gerald Marsh had helped her open an account. The roof was done before the next rain. She stood in the workroom during that rain and listened and heard nothing come through. The people from the ledger came in ones and twos, and then in a larger group, and then in a way that was not organized but felt like it. Nora had not summoned anyone. She had driven to 3 addresses in the first week: Margaret Fossey on Route 31, a man named Curtis Beckwith whose parents Carl and Lois appeared 4 times in the ledger, and a woman named June Harlan, whose father Harlan Pruitt had been Edmund's first entry in 1971. She had not explained much. She had shown each of them the relevant ledger page with their family's name on it and the banded bills she was returning, and said only that Edmund had asked her to see it done. None of them had known. That was the thing she had not fully prepared for, the complete surprise on each face, the particular quality of silence that follows learning that someone helped you without your knowledge and is now beyond the reach of thanks. June Harlan, who was 73 and drove a 10-year-old Ford pickup and wore her white hair in a long braid, had sat across from Nora at the cutting table for a full minute without speaking. Then she said her father had talked about that coat for years, the alteration Edmund had done, the price he had charged, which Harlan Pruitt had always said was too low. She said her father had never understood it. She said now she did. She wiped the back of her hand across her eyes once, and then folded the bills Nora had given her and put them in her shirt pocket and asked if she could see the ledger. Nora set it open in front of her. June Harlan ran her finger down the entries for her family's name and did not say anything. And after a while, she closed the ledger gently, as if it were something that deserved that care. Ruth Pickett came across the road on the Friday of the third week, carrying a folded length of olive cotton duck and a box of brass curtain rings without being asked. She had looked at the dressing room curtains on her first visit, the originals, which had gone gray at the hems and thin at the folds, and had said nothing at the time, which Nora now understood was Ruth's particular way of noting something she intended to address. She hung the new curtains herself, standing on the wooden stool with the rings on a dowel, while Nora ran a seam on the singer. The two of them did not talk much. They did not need to. When Ruth was done, she stepped back and looked at the three doorways and said that was better, and went back across the road. Gary Such sent a note. It arrived in a plain envelope, handwritten on his company's letterhead. A brief paragraph acknowledging that Nora had elected not to sell and wishing her well with the property. The tone was courteous and final, without subtext. She read it once and set it in the cedar box, which she had emptied of its original contents and now used as a kind of file for documents that seemed to matter. The 30-day offer window had passed without ceremony. Deirdre Amos filed the last of the paperwork on a Thursday and called to say everything was in order and that her bill was $450, which Nora paid by the end of the week. By the end of the third week, she had worked through all 217 entries in the ledger. 49 of the names belonged to people she could not locate, dead with no traceable family, or moved so far from Henlow that the connection had dissolved completely. She set those entries aside in a separate column on her pad and thought about them for several days without resolving the question. And then she deposited the corresponding amounts in a savings account at the Delverton Bank under the name Edmund had used for his own anonymous payments, and left it there for later, when she had a better answer. The community did not assemble dramatically. It happened the way things happen in small towns, gradually through proximity without announcement. People came in with alterations and stayed to talk. They mentioned Edmund in passing, in the way people mention someone who has been part of the texture of a place for so long that they are simply present in ordinary conversation. A man named Howard Vess said Edmund had once repaired his grandfather's dress uniform at no charge, the summer before a funeral. A woman named Patricia Dole said Edmund had replaced the lining of her winter coat 12 years ago and had used a silk she had never seen before, better than what the coat deserved, and had charged her for ordinary cotton. These were not confessions or testimonies. They were the small accumulated record of a man who had been quietly generous in ways both large and hidden and small and visible, and had not distinguished between the two. The young woman appeared on a Thursday afternoon in late April. She was perhaps 20, thin in the way of someone who has been eating carefully for a while, wearing a canvas jacket with a button missing at the collar and carrying a wool coat over her arm. A good coat, the kind worth repairing. She stood in the open doorway looking at the room before she stepped in, taking it in the way a person does when they are not sure they belong somewhere and are trying to determine the answer before committing to entry. Nora looked up from the cutting table. The young woman said she had a coat that needed a button and a seam at the left shoulder, and she had $7, and she understood if that wasn't enough. She said it quickly, the way people say things they have rehearsed. Nora told her to bring the coat to the table. She looked at the shoulder seam, a clean separation, the thread simply worn through, nothing damaged, and found a button in Edmund's tin that was close enough in size and color that the difference would not be noticeable from any reasonable distance. She told the young woman to sit on the stool. The work took 20 minutes. When it was done, she held the coat up to the light and checked the seam and checked the button and folded it and set it on the table. The young woman reached into her jacket pocket for the $7, and Nora shook her head once. The young woman looked at her. Nora said the button was from the bin and the seam was simple, and to come back if anything else needed attention. The young woman took the coat and stood in the doorway for a moment before she left, as if she wanted to say something, and could not find the right form for it. Then she went down the porch steps and up the dirt track toward the gravel road. Nora watched her go from the window. Evening was coming on, the light going low and amber through the bare branches, the marigolds in the window box catching it at an angle that made them look briefly lit from inside. Orange gold, full-headed now, the crackerjack variety growing tall the way Edmund had said it would if you let it. The singer was running. Farza, the wood stove ticked in the corner. The shop was warm. That was Edmund's way. Now it was hers.